to the Transformational Podcast, a conversation between brothers about practical ways faith is impacting our lives. We invite you to join us on this journey as we are learning to let faith transform the way we live. We are glad you are with us today and look forward to sharing our journey with you. Now let's jump in. Well, Chris, we've been going here for a few minutes, and to a certain extent, we're really kind of reflecting about what God's done with us in our past, and one of the things you brought up the last time we were talking, which I had actually more than anything, I've forgotten most of the story, and you reminded it to me, and it was the story of how we got our, I don't know, would that be our third house in Nacogdoches?
It's only the second one we remember, but yeah.
Yeah, right. It was the house we moved into as I believe as I was entering high school, and as you're just a couple years behind me. So
yeah, it was between seventh and eighth grade for me, and it was just kind of a reminder of, hey, this isn't the first faith journey our family's been through concerning a house, and we kind of thought back to that house and talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really kind of made us want to come back here today is partly actually is some of the stuff that even God speaks through Moses to his people. He talks about when they come out of Israel just prior to going into the promised land. In Deuteronomy 4:9, it says, only be careful and watch yourselves closely so you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. And, it's funny how quickly something as awesome and glorious as that was, that, we've been there. We've actually seen that. Where you're currently at is something we've actually seen firsthand, how quickly that kind of jumps from memory.
Right. Yeah, and it's a great story. And what's funny is that when my parents were in town helping us move, we were riding in the car. And my parents have been a part of this journey. I've shared this journey with them, and because they are people of faith. They really raised us up to know and follow Jesus, but not just in word, but in deed. And so I'm really grateful for that. And here's the thing. I think it's so, I don't want to put them on a pedestal so much to go, well, they're untouchable, because they're human too. But here's the thing. That's what was so great about watching them, because when they did mess up, they did say, hey, I messed up, and here's how I messed up, and here's what we need to do. And so really, it was great.
That's a parenting lesson they would preach, but that's for another time, right?
Yeah, it is. But yeah. I think it's important piece. So we're driving down the road, about to take a load to storage, and my dad and I just happened to get into a conversation about the house. And I think he said, this isn't the first time, God's done something with the house in our family. And I said, you're right. And, Dad, I was going to ask you about that. And so I got to ask him about it. And he reminded me of pieces of the story, honestly, pieces I didn't even know. And so I just thought it'd be so good to potentially get him on and let him just talk about the story and what God did with that house, because I think it's faith inspiring to me. And so anyway, I'm gonna take the headphones off, scoot over, and let him get in the seat, and so he'll get to tell the story.
Let's get him in there. Well, Dad, we're gonna got you in the seat, and as Chris was in the hot seat, as Chris kind of related as you were coming on camera there, whether you could hear my half of it or not. I frankly, I don't remember the house story as well as probably even Chris does. Now, you guys have had an opportunity to talk about it a little bit as you were doing his move. But I'll tell you what I more or less remember, and then I'll kind of walk you through some of the questions that I had as I was trying to recall what happened, is that essentially sometime around the time when I was going into high school, we found a house that we thought would fit our family a little better. The house was more than we could afford. And so we saw that as kind of the death of well, this isn't it. And we more or less closed the book on that. And then miraculously through a saint, like a true saint of the faith, um, helped us basically move into the house. Had two house payments for a little bit, weren't even sure why the other house wasn't selling. And then the moment at which we could move into the new house, and I say new because we had to do quite a bit of work to make that house livable, safely livable. The Lord sold the other house, and it was, I almost couldn't have made better timing in my mind. Now, granted, I was just, you call it a strong back and a willing heart. You were the one having to balance everything. So, um, I'm just curious. Like, let's just start from the beginning. Why did we move, and what were you praying for during that time?
Well, the funny thing is, your mother and I have discussed this over the years, off and on. Is the original move was prompted by the fact that our house was so small, and you guys were in a room so small. Frankly, we were beginning to feel more like referees at wrestling matches than we were parents,
Yeah,
because y'all had some. Yeah, I mean, you were growing young guys, and you were just into it, and we knew that we needed to. We'd pretty well outgrown it, so we began to pray, and we put it on the prayer altar. Now, let me pause and add one other thing. Prior to this, we had, over the last year or two before that, at church, been through the Christian Financial Concepts course by Larry Burkett, who at that time was kind of the precursor to what later became Dave Ramsey. As a matter of fact, Dave Ramsey will tell you he learned a great deal from Larry Burkett before he died. So we had covenanted that whatever we did, we would work as quickly as we could to be as debt free as we could. In other words, we were not going to load up on a lot more debt. So
yeah.
with
So
that said,
when you committed to do that, give us an idea, or give us an idea. I kind of remember on the income scale, would you consider us, middle class, upper class? Now everybody thinks, something different in themselves, but just for folks who, what was your perspective of where we were at, and did we have a ton of debt at the time, and we're just digging out of like a couple $1,000s, or were we, sorry, a little debt, a couple $1,000s, were we digging out of a rather large hole?
yes and yes. I was an entrepreneur who had a business that was growing very rapidly. So basically, everything that I made initially was going back into the business. And God blessed that over the years. It grew to be a very successful business that He allowed me to sell nicely later on.
But
But
those
your
were the
mother,
early days.
yes, these were the very early days. It was all going
Right.
back into the business. And
Yeah.
your mother was a physical therapist and doing well at the hospital, but I mean, it was a rural hospital by definition, so she wasn't getting the same type of salary they would get, say, in a Dallas or a Fort Worth or a larger metropolitan area. So
Yeah.
I would say that technically we probably were middle class to just below whatever people define that loosely as.
Yep. Yep.
And we decided through prayer, it's like, all right, let's begin to float the options. And one of the things, if you remember, we did, we kind of sat around the table a time or two, and we would sketch out what could we do to this house if we did an addition to enlarge it. If you remember, it was a very unusual lot that had a very quick slope off the back. So we knew there would be some challenges there. And in the meantime, I said to your mother, I said, let's at least see if God would provide something out there on the market. We began to look. You guys didn't really go with us initially to any of those. We would go, and we're praying about this the whole time. God, just please give us your house. Give us the wisdom to know. And we would walk out of them, and either your mother, and I'm kind of picking on her, but guys that are married will know, the woman would go, nope, that's not it. And you go, yep, you're right, that's not it.
Yeah.
But then
Because
there were a few.
you were praying not necessarily for a thing, you were praying for the wisdom to know where God was taking you. And so
Absolutely.
mom, who is a saint, as we both know, spends a lot of time in prayer, and God would just be like, no, this isn't it. It had nothing to do with,
Now,
maybe sometimes it did, but really, let's be real, nothing to do. And I know that because I know where we ended up buying, and it had nothing to do
yeah.
with the condition of the house.
Well, and there was one other factor. If you'll remember, your mother and I were very, very involved within the college ministry at church, as well as other parts of our church at the time. And we had always used our home we'd open it up. I mean, how many times do you remember a group of college kids landing there at the house, to
Yeah, it
meet
was
or
normal.
whatever? It was normal.
That was normal. Yep.
And we wanted something where we could do even more of that. So we looked, could not find anything. And then I think she was the one that spotted it in the newspaper, or maybe I saw the sign just driving by. It was a lady that had been her first Sunday school teacher when we first arrived there in East Texas. And the joke, and it's not a joke in a bad sense, it was a very inspirational saying, was this lady knew the Lord. She walked so closely to God that, the joke was, okay, you and I could show up in God's presence with her, and God would look at her and say, hey, how you doing? And then say, well, who are these two with you? She was just, she was the epitome of what I would call a saint this side of heaven. Knew the Lord, but very, very practical in her faith. Well, I took your mother and we went by and we looked, and we walked in, and you remember what the house was like. Very old. Very old.
Yeah.
And
if I remember right, it was built in the 50s. It was built in the 50s by somebody who, though, was a builder. And and what I remember is old, but it was well made. So when they say the bones are solid, that would have been an understatement on this house specifically, because the builder built it for himself, and he was very serious about it being solid.
Yeah, he was a civil engineer. And later on, when we did progress to where we looked like we were going to, I had two different builders in town, independently of each other. They did not know the other one was going. I said, would you go look at this house and just give me your scope on it? What do you think? Is it good? Now, Robert, one of them, well, you knew both of them, but they both came back and said yes. But one of them told me, he said, that house, the whole neighborhood will blow away, and that house will never move. He said, as a matter of fact, if you guys don't buy it, we're going to buy it as a family. He was that sold on it, just looking at the bones.
Now what was also interesting, after the bones, my recollection of the house is the other part, the exterior, the what covered the bones, was also from the 1950s. And we're talking, I think we were looking at this house in the late 90s? Like 90, probably.
No, it would have been, no, it would have been a little bit earlier than that. When did you graduated from high school? We won't tell that, but
yeah. So it was about 93, 94, I promise.
I think so.
Not to do the math in public. But I do recall, like, there were let's put it this way, this is one of my memories of the house when we were cleaning out the back. And I don't know if you remember, we pulled all the carpet out and all this other stuff, and we were literally shoveling dirt out the back door because it was it had been that dirty back there. It was a kind of one of those places where people were allowed to crash, like a crash pad, because the previous owner was very
people too.
Yeah, very kind in general. So anyway, I do recall it had a little bit of work to be done.
Yeah, it did. And I walked in with your mother that first time, and we walked through the house, and of course it was empty by now. Both the owners were in nursing homes, and I will never forget. We get back in the car and we're driving up the road. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh man, there's no way she's fixing to unload on me for us even coming. Your mother turns to me and she says, here's the problem. And I thought, okay, good. We're fixing to solve this right now. Yeah. I can put every piece of furniture that I have somewhere in that house. And I went, uh-oh.
That's not what I had in mind.
That's not what I had in mind. So I said, okay, let's go home and pray. And what we did was we felt God was at least asking us to take a step of faith. We put earnest money down the very next day. I went in and I told I asked the real estate person, and you know him, key real estate person in town. I said, is there anything special we need to know? He said, no one's looking at it because it is so old and it needs so much work. And I said, okay, we're going to put a contract, but we must begin to try to see if we can do this. And I said, it'll be contingent on the selling of our house unless something miraculous happens. Because I said, we're working to get out of debt totally. We can't take on a lot of more debt. And he said, well, just in case, here's my amortization chart. I'll let you borrow it so you can kind of play with numbers. So we went home. We began to look at the numbers. We just did the normal due diligence that you would do. And we prayed so hard, God, please give us clarity. And the clarity at that moment was based on the conditions that were predicating everything at that moment. No. And I don't know if you'll remember.
because the upgrades were not the upgrades. Sorry, it was, I wouldn't call it upgrades because we're really talking about making it livable. There were
Just renovating
some
it totally. Yeah.
serious safety things, renovations we did. There were some, I call them aesthetic renovations, which would probably be cheap. And then there were the middle of the road ones that, while not aesthetic, mom probably be like, yeah, you're going to have to get that figured out before I get in there. So, I mean, we had the whole range. We had the whole range, everything from safety to non-safety, but some major things that needed to be done.
Yep, absolutely. And so there came a point, though, where we said this would not be wise. You can do things where God says scripturally just absolutely don't. And then many times he gives us principles and guiding guideposts. And if we went by those principles, it was no, we can't. This would be trying to take God and put him in our framework instead of us working where God wants us to work. And
yeah, you know what's funny about that? Sometimes he lets us step off into those areas. In other words, if you would have stepped out, do you think he would have stopped you? Would he have held you back? Probably not. He probably would have let you step into that. And you would have put yourself in a place that, financially speaking, wouldn't have been good. You would actually basically gone back to ground zero, if not prior to that. And I personally have had this happen even in my own life, where I was looking for a vehicle and I chased that vehicle, and I convinced myself that this was the vehicle and God was making it happen, so to say. And I stepped into it without him necessarily providing. And what I learned through that actually was the following years, as I'm paying that truck payment, the amount seriously though, the amount I was paying towards that truck payment was the amount I was unable to bless other people, where I was able to do that prior to this. Like the times when I could just, hey, let me help out. And I could, that was gone. And God said, hey, Robert, I let you, I let you step into that decision. Hopefully you're learning something here. And I did learn something. So he could have let you step into that house.
Yeah. And to me, he lets us do that, and particularly when we're not really listening, we'll do that. And that's what I had done. So often we'll run ahead of God and we'll say, okay, here I am, God, now come bless me. And God's like, whoa, time out. That's good, but that's not best. And there's some pitfalls there.
So at this moment in your life, you're doing it right.
We were not going to do it. So your mother said, what are we going to tell the kids? I said, we're going to use this as a lesson to show them that not all the time does God seek to fulfill wishes, desires, and prayers. Many times it's teaching us the principle of obedience. And so we had that time. We sat down with y'all. If you remember, we were doing family devos about once a week at least. And we did a devo on the death of a vision, how sometimes God allows a vision to die. We don't know why. There may be something better down the road, usually is, but he wants to know, will you be obedient to me? And we felt it was more important to set that example in front of y'all openly than to try to sneak around and say, well, it just didn't work out, or we just, make up the excuses like many parents will do with their kids. It's like, no.
And you know what? You know what principle you guys were like landing on? And I know you know this, but I want to throw this out there for folks who are listening, right? It's a principle actually that was set out even when the Israelites, again, Chris and I talked about it earlier about writing the things on the doorposts, but there were other things that happened where God gave them certain, we'll call it laws and rules and things for living, not to necessarily beat them down, but so that they could live better, that they could actually live above the fray. It was actually seen as revolutionary for the time, because it brought not just order, it brought peace and it brought joy, and there were things that it did. And he talks about it in Deuteronomy 6:10. This is really the principle you were following. Is it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, Jacob to give you, a land with large flourishing cities that you didn't build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied by all the things, by the way, I'm going to put my point in here, all the things that you didn't do anything to get, he says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Fear the Lord your God, serve only him, and take your oaths in his name. And then it goes back through, he basically steps through, like, this is, you should, basically the 10 commandments, love the Lord your God, and only him, and etc.
Right.
And so what y'all did is y'all said, hey, this isn't us necessarily getting blessed because, we're not getting the house at this point in our mind. This is just an opportunity to go to teach kids, to raise them up in the way they should go, so they don't depart from it later. That's a proverb. So that, we're at least understanding from a spiritual aspect, we're growing with you because you're growing too, but you're allowing us to take the journey with you. And I don't remember necessarily the specifics. If I were to be honest, I'm old enough to forget things now. I don't
No
remember
comment.
the specifics. Yeah, exactly. Because that makes you worse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember the lessons that were taught, the foundational pieces. So anyway, you take us through the depth of a vision.
And during that time, for me, it was particularly tough because I wanted, as any father would, I wanted the best for my family, just like our Heavenly Father wants the best for us. And I ended up having to land heavily back on Psalm 46:10, where God just said, "Hey, be still, and know I'm God."
That I'm God. Yeah.
And I didn't understand what that meant at the time. I just knew the be still was really, really tough for me. You know me, you're cut from the same thing. We're action-oriented people. See, do, salute, execute, that type of thing. So time rocks along. We begin to scratch out what would a change in our house here look like. And then we begin to look at the finances of that. And we're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if we can even do that. What are we going to do? About that time, I walked back into the realtor's office to return his amortization chart.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks. Didn't work out. He rounds the corner of his office, and to this day, I can hear his laughter as he and if you'll remember this gentleman, that was not a normal part of his character. I mean, he wasn't a morose person. He just didn't spontaneously laugh a lot. He just broke into guffaws, hee-haws of laughter. And I said, what's going on? He said, you're not going to believe who's here. And I said, well, enlighten me. He said, come around the corner here. And it was this saint, this lady, and her husband, who was, and she was still married. He was still alive. It was her brother. And he's laughing because he had heard me in there. And I said, okay, fill me in. What's going on here?
Still not in on the joke, yeah.
Yes, I'm still an outsider. And he said, the brother came by to let you know that the lady and her husband prayed about it, and they want you to have that house. They want you to have that house badly enough that they would offer to us, principal only payments until the death at the level you can afford. You pick the level at the level you can afford until the death of the final survivor, at which point, if there's any principal left, it will revert as a simple interest note to one of the encampments, the religious encampments in that area.
And I mean, people can't see the look on my face right now unless you're on the YouTube.
Yeah.
But it's a look of, has anybody even heard of that being done? Is that even a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
I had to ask them to go back through it again. I thought I misunderstood something. Yeah. Because in my head, I'm doing some quick math and I'm like, okay, here's about what we could do. And when we sell our house, we could apply it, et cetera, and so forth. And they were willing to do it at a reduced price too. So I said, hold that thought, because right. I wanted to talk to your mother. One of the things that I had learned over the years, and if there's any guys listening to us that are married, I want them to understand something. The worst thing you can do is make a decision without at least bringing your wife, your partner for life, into it, particularly if she walks with God, because they come with a different perspective, they come with a balance, and they come looking at things a little differently. So some of the dumbest mistakes I'd ever made financially were those I made without asking your mother, at least discussing it with her. So I go home, discuss with her, and she was as shocked as I was. And
I bet she probably was like, can you go back and get that in writing? Because I don't believe you.
Well, we prayed over it that night, and we both felt God was giving us total freedom. Now, the challenge was we still had a house. We also had another house that now we basically were going to have to gut and put a good bit of money into.
Was our house on the market at that time? The one we had that we were living in?
No.
Was that on the market?
No. Because once again, we didn't know if we were going to buy or if we were going to build, just remodel where we were.
You were this was pre on the market. I gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. So I go back the next day, signed they applied the earnest money that we'd put down just to hold it. And we began the process to go ahead and do the actual purchase. Um, at that point, we put our house on the market, and we got virtually no nibbles for the first 4 weeks. And I'm like, oh, great. This is not
I
going
just
the
bought a
direction it
house
needs to
and I
go.
can't get rid of
Yeah,
the other
exactly.
house.
As soon as we signed for the new old house, there had been some money that we had set aside. We pulled everything out of savings. And you remember the massive gutting process we went to. You've already talked about the stuff under the carpet in the back. It wasn't they were slovenly people. It was an old house, old carpet, and
50
old
years.
floors. Yes.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, we forgot to mention the wiring that was aluminum, would not even pass codes these days.
I'd call that the safety upgrades that I was mentioning.
My goodness, because I'll never forget looking in the panel originally and going, oh, cool, copper wire. It was done by, actually, the craftsman who did it did beautiful, elegant work in wiring it. And back in those days, aluminum was code.
And in fact, I was going to say most of the work was very well done. It was
Robert, before we even moved to where we are now, and we'd sold that house, I was redoing something, and a house that was now over 60 years old was still square at every point that I needed it to be square. Not 1/4 of an inch movement. That house was
so well
solid.
done. But how many months did that take us?
I think it took us about 2 months to get it to where we could move in. We had to pull all the wiring out. Both you and your brother helped. I think you had band activities in the evening sometimes, and I had to work all day, and then we'd work on it. And he was the one that I kept telling him, turn the circuit off, make sure it's off before you go under there. And I kept hearing
I was going to make the joke that I was the one with the fewest number of electrocutions. Chris, on the other hand, he's still got a screw loose.
I kept hearing this, ouch, and sometimes he'd bang his head against the bottom of the floor if he was underneath. But it was like, did you turn the circuit off?
That took us like what, 2-3 months? I mean, I think it was 2 months, 2.5 months till we could even think about moving in. Now, what's happening with the other house at this point?
Zip.
Nothing.
We had gotten 1 or 2 looks at it, and we're like, well, okay, thank you, Lord, that you allowed us to structure to where it's going to be tight. And then I think
we actually talked about it at the very end there. And we're like, no kidding, wrapping it up. And I want to say, because you know how it is, you're working and everybody's in tight spaces. And, as I recall, it was hot days because, you're in the attic and this stuff. And it's one of those moments where you're taking a water break. And I was like, so, we're going to move in, and the other house, like, what's up with that? And you're like, yeah, well, no one's really looking at it. So we might own 2 houses for a little bit. Not really sure what's going on. But I do recall it was I don't know whether it was a weekend or during the week. You and Mom were like, okay, it's go time. We're moving. Like, we're moving all that junk from one house to the next. We're going to live in this house. This is going to be the livable house.
That's right. Oh, by the way, did we forget to mention that now means 2 sets of utilities too, and all of the 2 sets of insurance payments and everything that goes with it.
So what did God do? Because this is the best part.
When we got ready to move, and we literally had moved, and I think it's within like 10 days, all of a sudden we get a contract. Somebody coming in from out of town. Of course, the realtor said, well, it's because it's empty now, and y'all cleaned it up real good, and it looked nice. Well, no, it's because God decided to go ahead. He had allowed us to move. So now get this other burden out from under your feet.
And it honestly wasn't fully empty, because what I remember is us getting our last load out the week prior to have to be out.
Yep.
So to your point, it really had nothing to do with the state of the house. It had to do with the state of the timing. God had basically said, hey, you guys had prayed in faith for a place to help grow the family, because you're right, Chris and I were in tight quarters, as well as Lou Ellen and the rest. And you had prayed for a place. God had provided it, not just provided it in financial speaking, but in his own timing, so that when we finally got done getting it ready to make it livable, and honestly, the bulk of the stuff had been moving or was in transit, essentially, God's like, okay, we can sell that house now. He sells the other house. And, as Bob is your uncle, yes, that is sort of a joke.
Got it.
Anyway, yeah. Anyway, we were able to sell the other house, right?
Yeah. Sold it. We moved in, and if you'll remember, we had a blessing ceremony on the house because that house had been occupied by very, very godly people who had used it for everything for the Lord, and we were determined that that would be the same thing. That's why we had prayed about the house. That's why we had prayed about moving. We needed more space to do ministry on a day-to-day basis, and so we blessed it. We just asked God to carry the blessing forward. Now, do you remember the prayer room?
I do remember the prayer room, and it was almost sacred. It was almost holy because of the amount of time that the previous owner had spent in it.
Unbelievable with that beautiful. And then when I heard the story about the stained glass and everything
And for
that had
those
to
who
do with
don't
it,
know, it was a stained glass window from a church that while it was being either moved or renovated or whatever.
They were actually going to tear the church down. It was an
That's
old
okay.
church, and this was a panel of stained glass that they used to do entire sides of churches with these panels. And this panel was at the very top, and it depicted the entrance into the Holy of Holies. And her husband,
Yeah.
as a civil engineer driving around doing his various projects, had seen this, acquired the thing, and then they had put it there, and it faced to the east. And every morning with that east sun, she prayed for people specifically. Had a
And frankly,
fishbowl on one side and took names
that's
out.
where yeah.
Yep.
And that's where she entered into the Holy of Holies every morning.
Yep.
And that gets back to some of the stuff that Chris and I talk about, that sometimes, that's sets and reps for her. And so maybe it's something that Chris and I will talk about in a future podcast. But the point is like she showed up every morning, she put in those sets and reps, and she was in the Holy of Holies. And as she spent that time, as she spent that time, she became even more and more in a closer walk and kind of a closer fellowship with the Lord.
And here's what's neat.
Go ahead.
Let me put the closure on that one. What was fascinating was we didn't know about this till we bought the house years later. When we got there, your mother's in her Sunday school class. We always used to marvel at about every 6 weeks or so, she would get a phone call. And I'm not mimicking her. I'm not making fun of her, but we'd get this craggy, well, how y'all doing? I've been praying for you. And it was always a very specific question about a very specific prayer that your mother had, or I had already forgotten. We'd ask her to pray for it. And we didn't know she's taking them out of the fishbowl, praying for it. And everyone that she prayed for that day got a call that night. And then she'd put them back in the fishbowl or put new prayers in the fishbowl. And then when one bowl was empty, she'd swap over and go again. She was that big on sets and reps, as you put it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's crazy. So before we kind of close this part out and I throw Chris back in the seat, was there a verse or was there any foundational biblical truth, aside from the fact that, you'd gone through the Donna Burkett thing and you had really were very intent on not getting back into, a mountain of debt? When you stepped out in faith, was there any other, we'll call it bedrock foundational scripture that God was just laying on your heart? And if not, I mean, if you can't remember it, that's fine. I realize that was quite some time ago. But I'm just curious from your perspective.
I think the biggest one that probably impacted us during that time was the Jeremiah 29:11, which I recognize you have to read that in context many times for what God was saying in the totality of those verses there. But, when he said, I have a plan for you, I think that many times we think God has a plan. Okay, I tell you what, I'm going to go do something and I'm going to ask you to bless that plan. Well, wait a minute, that wasn't God's plan. It comes back to obedience. And our whole thing was, God, help us to be obedient to the leading of your Spirit. Help us not to run ahead of you this time. We've done that. It didn't go well. We don't want to do that again. And
well, I appreciate you. Yeah, I appreciate you telling the story. I certainly appreciate the walk down memory lane. It was fun. What we'll do is we'll pause here, and then we'll throw Chris back in.
That's great.
Well, Chris, I'm glad to get you back in the seat. Obviously, you were listening to the story, getting your memory refreshed as I was, because you were sitting just off camera. It's interesting. You're walking through this now. You're kind of in that in between of like, well, the death of a vision and an unlikely meeting. And we did talk about the waiting last time. But I think to a certain extent, the question that I would offer to you, and I think we understand, or at least both agree on this, why is it that we wanted to even tell this story?
Honestly, because I think this is when it comes down to what is transformational faith? Like what is it? What is faith in general? What is it supposed to be? Well, it's supposed to be transformational. It's supposed to be something that affects your everyday life, your everyday decisions. But the reality is that if we're truly going to fully follow God, there's going to be times that He asks us to do things that says, "Hey, you're not going to have control. You're not going to even necessarily know the outcome. You're just going to be able to know what I told you to do. And I want to see, are you willing to trust me?" And I think when it comes down to it, that's the idea of transformational faith is, are we willing to trust God's way over our own way? The trust in the Lord with all your heart, in all that you are. And don't lean on your own understanding.
Because it doesn't make sense.
Right, because it likely is not going to make sense at times. But in all your ways, this is Proverbs 3:5-6. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, meaning, hey, in every part of your life, look to Him and say, all right, God, with this, what do you want to do? With this, what do you want me to do? God, what do I need to know? And what do you want me to do? And with all of those things, in all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Now,
absolutely.
That doesn't mean you're going to be able to see the entire path, but you're going to be able to see the next step on the path.
He promises straightness, not visibility.
That's right. That's right. The visibility is not important, right? It's saying, all right, I'll trust God. Because when it comes down to it, the point of make His path straight, it means, hey, He's going to show you the direction. You don't have to worry about what's coming. Just stay on the path He's leading you on.
That is true, man. And so if you were, let's fast forward, to a month or two from now, maybe it's a year from now or whatever, and you've stepped into God's promise, whatever that looks like at that time, based on kind of the opportunity that we just took, to sit and think about the stories of old, God's faithfulness of old. What foundational verse would you land on? Where would you camp out?
So part of the heartbeat of telling these stories and telling these stories in general, not just for us, but even bringing my kids into this, is what we see here in Psalm 86. It's a Psalm of Asaph. And I'm going to just go ahead and start with verse 1 because
it helps. Psalm 78 or Psalm 86? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Because you said Psalm of Asaph, and I don't know that that's one of them.
Is it?
Because 86 is a prayer of David. I think you're in 78.
Oh, there we go. Just looking at the wrong one.
Put them glasses back on there, guy.
I flipped the wrong way. It's Psalm 86, and he says, and I'll start with verse 1 there also. It says, "Bend down, O Lord, and hear my prayer. Answer me, for I need your help. Protect me, for I'm devoted to you. Save me, for I serve you and I trust you. You are my God. Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I'm calling on you constantly. Give me happiness, O Lord, for I give myself to you. O Lord, you are so good, so ready to forgive, so full of unfailing love for all who ask for your help. Listen closely to my prayer, O Lord. Hear my urgent cry. I will call to you whenever I'm in trouble, and you will answer me." And there's a heart behind just saying, man, I truly believe that He calls us into these places where we will cry out to Him and say, hey, cry out to me. I will answer you. I'm here. You can trust me. I'll protect you. I'll provide for you. And ultimately, Robert, what Jesus says, He came to give us a full and satisfying life. The lie is that if we follow Jesus, we're going to miss out on the full and satisfying life, which is the lie that comes from the enemy, the devil, right? The truth is that our own way leads to more trouble and more problems. But if we trust God, it doesn't mean it won't be without trials. It just means that He will show up in the midst of them and blow us away.
Yeah, and He does. And so that's what we're expecting. Well, I'm glad we pulled that in today. And I look forward to maybe pulling Julie in, next time.